I am, as said, principal analyst at the Work Foundation, and I'm here basically in my capacity as part-time PhD student. So I started with it 3 years ago, and I have until 2027 to go. So this is still all in its relatively early stages, but what I've got today are some descriptive findings and some sort of early indicators for what insecurity at the early career stage is doing to people sort of down the line. So basically what I found was that a lot of people talking about insecurity tend to use one form of insecurity. They tend to use temporary work or 0-hour contracts, and they're sort of tracking the number of people who are in that kind of work and how it's affecting them. But through some of the research that I've been doing at the Work Foundation, I found that a lot of people, many more people than I had initially thought, were subject to more than one form of insecurity at the same time. And so what I'm looking at is cumulative forms of insecurity and how that both has changed over the past decades and how an early career start in insecure forms of work is impacting people over time. So I'm using Understanding Society for this survey, and I'll sort of get back to the data itself. But so instead of looking at one particular form of insecurity, like 0-hour contracts, which is a really quintessential form of insecurity, I'm looking at this in a sort of a more holistic, multidimensional way. So I'm using these dimensions: contractual, financial insecurity, and lack of access to rights and protections. Contractual insecurity really means where people are not guaranteed future hours or future work. Financial insecurity means where people might have unpredictable pay, or their pay is simply too low to get by, or they have some other measure kind of some economic need. And then a lack of access to rights and protections, measuring that particularly through solo self-employment. So people who are freelancers or subcontractors, and they don't have employees themselves. None of those forms of work indicate bad work per se, but for a lot of people, multiple forms of insecurity come together, and that can affect them negatively, both in terms of their health and stress levels, but also in terms of their ability to obtain kind of future work. So what I'm doing here is that I have these 6 indicators. And when people have 2 of these or more, I class them as being insecure. And kind of the framework through, kind of the mechanism through which that works is from, so this sits very firmly in kind of the career mobility literature. And basically hypothesizing that if people start out in insecure work at the early stages, that could affect them over time. And the way that that affects them could be through path dependence. Really the idea that later outcomes are related to earlier outcomes. This is often described as the Matthew effect, cumulative advantage or disadvantage, and specific to career mobility as the tournament model. But the basic idea is that small differences initially can grow out to increasing divergence over time. Then I'm also looking at labor market segmentation. So really the idea that the labor market is divided into these 2 segments. One is the primary segment, in which people have access to high paying, quite secure jobs. There's a lot of employment protection around them. And then you have people in the secondary segment, who are in more insecure jobs, often lower paid jobs. And the real issue is that they have trouble. People in that secondary segment struggle to gain access to that first segment. And the reason why insecure workers might struggle to obtain secure work is through 2 main mechanisms there, signaling and human capital generation. So signaling, so at the moment when an employer is hiring somebody, they can't really know how productive a worker is going to be. And so they make a decision based on someone's observable characteristics and their CV. So for insecure workers, they often tend to have quite fragmented employment histories. And that can then affect their ability to be hired. There's also human capital generation. So unfortunately, people in insecure kind of jobs, they are less likely to have access to training and development. And the training that they get tends to be more compliance-based than sort of focusing on advancement or development. So that means there's a really great example of these teachers in academia who might be on these very short-term contracts, and so thus they're kind of bouncing around. And that means that they can't adapt or they can't improve their specific course like year on year on year. And it might mean that their ratings are lower, that their feedback is worse, and thus they might then struggle to obtain a secure job over time. Now, of course, there's room here for people's agency. People can and do opt into specific forms of work. But I think particularly politically, there's been this narrative that people love the flexibility in those jobs, and therefore it's good for both employers and for workers. And actually what I found particularly through the work that I've done at the Work Foundation is that a lot of people are hugely constrained in their job options. So yes, they do opt into things like 0-hour contracts because they need flexibility, but they are forced into trading off security for flexibility because the system is very badly set up for them. So particularly people with health conditions or disabilities, they often need specific kinds of flexibility to manage their conditions, and that kind of flexibility can be really hard to come by in more sort of classically secure jobs. And thus they kind of opt into these kinds of roles. So as I'd mentioned, for this study, I'm using Understanding Society and its predecessor, the British Household Panel Survey. So I've got to date about 29 waves of data running from the early 90s all the way until the recent years. Currently, these findings just reflect some descriptive statistics so far, some survival analysis and event history analysis. And at the end, I'll say a little bit more about where I'm planning to go from here. I don't know if you've heard this as well, but I've heard a lot from people saying that they really think that insecurity in the labor market has exploded over the past number of years. And using this data, that is not borne out by kind of the measures that I'm using don't bear that out. So basically what we're seeing here is that the proportion of working age people who are in work who are experiencing 2 or more forms of insecurity is actually quite stable over time. So relatively high there in the early 90s, potentially related to quite a challenging economic climate at the time, and then rising again sort of in the wake of the global financial crisis. Now, I've benchmarked this as well against the labor force survey across the same time period, and the trend is very similar. The percentages of people in insecure work are slightly different because the measures are different, but the trend overall is highly similar. When we look deeper, because of course that holistic measure of insecurity is hiding a lot of variation in kind of changes in the underlying indicators. So the lines in this graph refer to the left axis running from 0 to 40%, and the bars refer to the right-hand axis running from 0 to 7%. So what we can see here is that in terms of financial insecurity, we've actually seen, on the whole, quite a bit of volatility, but on the whole, a bit of a decline over time. Although from the global financial crisis onwards until now, there is a slight rise. And why we might have seen that decline over that period of time is that we've had the national minimum wage, which has reduced sort of levels of very, very low pay in work. Also, people's volatile pay has gone down a little bit, but clearly there is still quite a bit of financial insecurity there. Contractual insecurity, a fairly steady line over time, slightly higher proportions of people were contractually insecure in the 90s, and then again a bit of a rise over the past couple of years, but mostly quite a flat line. And then for the rights-based dimension, that is linked entirely to people who are in solo self-employment. And we know that that number has gone up in recent years. So that just means that there is a greater number of people then who are working, but for example, who would not be entitled to sick pay, maternity pay, holiday pay, etc. Now, what I'm looking at is that early career stage. So I've isolated people who have over those 29 waves, who have entered into the labor market between the ages of 16 to 24, and really people who move into work from full-time education. So right here, I still excluded people who move into work via a period of unemployment because effects for them are a bit different. But over those 29 waves, we have over 11,000 of those transitions of young people moving into work. Because that age period is sort of so demarcated, we are losing out on about 10% of transitions of people who basically transition into work from full-time education somewhat later in their 20s or even in their 30s. So missing out on a lot of PhD students here, basically. And I'm only using first transitions, so not multiple transitions of people who go back to school. So here we're seeing that up until about 2007, the majority of those transitions from education into work were transitions into insecure work. Over 60% around 1996, 1997, but that number has come down over time, and now about 40% of people who enter the labor market at that age end up in insecure work. But I think, as you remember, the figure of insecurity overall has been relatively stable, and it's even gone up slightly over the past couple of years. So although maybe young people at this age are less likely to transition into insecurity, perhaps the ones that do end up in insecurity stay in insecurity longer, or there are more transitions later on in life, but something is happening that makes that proportion of workers who experience insecurity overall is quite stable. Some of the really quite striking findings from this is that people from working class backgrounds were much more likely than people from a more privileged backgrounds, so who have parents from a higher professional or managerial background, to kind of end up in insecure work in that first entry. So people from a working class background make up 35% of the overall workforce, but the rate of transition here is nearly double that of people from a higher professional and managerial background. So there's some real inequality there in that likelihood of entering into insecure work. Now, women over time are a little bit more likely than men to be in insecure work, or to transition into insecure work at that early career stage. There is a little bit of convergence over time, but they remain more likely to enter into insecure work. Quite interestingly, women do have a high transition rate out of insecurity as well. But overall, they're still more likely to be in insecure work. So I've done a bit of survival analysis as well, and some looking at, of course, some people are more likely than others to be in insecure work, but it's not just about entering into insecure work, but more about, do people leave it as well, or do people get stuck in it? Is it basically a trap? And luckily, we can say that actually for a lot of people, the majority will enter insecure work and leave it within about a year. So that's a fairly positive thing. But if you look at this graph, you can see as well that after about 3 years, 80% of people who'd transitioned into insecurity right after leaving school, they will have left insecurity. So they've actually obtained a secure job. I'm excluding people here who have become inactive or unemployed. But there's also 20% of people that will stay in insecurity for more than 3 years. And for some people, as you can see with that really, really long tail there, some people stay in insecure work for decades. And that is a very small proportion of people, but that is not insignificant. So with the survival analysis that I've done, some of the most determinative factors for whether people are stuck in work, stuck in insecure work, is the duration of their stay in insecurity. So the longer you stay in insecure work, the more your chances of getting out drop, basically. And also the types of jobs that people do matter a lot. Insecure work tends to be concentrated in more semi-routine and routine occupations, sort of more manual kind of jobs. And also the exit rate from those jobs is lower than in sort of higher skilled jobs. Where I'm planning to kind of go from here is that this is going to be the first chapter of my PhD. From here, I'm going to do a sequence analysis to properly track how the trajectories of people who start out in insecure work are kind of different than for other people. So sequence analysis kind of derives from the biological sciences, sequencing of DNA. So you can use that as well for people-specific labor market situations, and then you use an algorithm to see how similar or dissimilar their patterns are over time. Right, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.